guys, so in this video I'm going to take you through how to build up and develop your improvisation from scratch. So we're going to start really simple as a complete beginner might start improvising, and then slowly build up to something much more complex and interesting. So our goal is to create an improvisation that sounds complex, but that is conceptually quite simple, so that it's easy to think about and implement, but nevertheless sounds quite interesting. And we're going to do this by starting with a very simple base and gradually adding more and more layers of complexity until we have something that can pass for a jazz improvisation. Now, as my example, I'm going to be improvising over section A of the jazz standard Autumn Leaves. And I'm just going to be using the basic 7th chords in my left hand in close position. So we're not going to be doing anything fancy with the chords. We're not going to use any nice chord voicings or substitutions or anything like that, because we're focusing on the improvisation in this video. So it kind of already assumes that you know how to play the jazz chords, and so that part's covered. So section A of Autumn Leaves goes as follows. Right, that's the basic chords and the basic melody. So this song modulates between the key of B flat major and G natural minor, which are just the relative major and minor keys. So we're just going to be using the B flat major scale to improvise over this song. Now, in order to concretely show how you can build up and develop your improvisation, I'm going to break down my improvisation into a series of levels, with level 1 being really basic beginner improvisation, and level 10 being much more advanced and complex improvisation. Alright, so let's begin. So we've learned the chords and the melody of our song. So level 1 improvisation is just going to be using the melody of the song, but embellishing it slightly. So varying the rhythm a little bit, putting in some ornamentation or some fills over long notes or rests. So to begin with, we're going to just play the melody, and on these long notes, we're going to play a really short, simple phrase, largely using the B flat major scale, and then continue on with the melody. So we're going to insert little fills in between our melody. So doing this, we could get something like this. Right, so really simple improvisation. So we're just using the melody and putting in little fills. Now there, my fills were really quite short and were largely diatonic, so they just used the B flat major scale. But the benefit of using this approach to improvisation is that you can more or less play any notes you want, even notes outside of the scale. So they're going to clash a little bit, they're going to create a little bit of tension, but then as soon as you come back to playing the melody, we resolve that tension and play the melody. So that actually sounds quite good. That way you create some tension and then you resolve it by coming back to the melody. Right, so there my fills were a little bit more chromatic, which created a bit of tension, but then I slipped back into that melody and resolved that tension. Right, so that's a really good way for a complete beginner to start improvising. Just play the melody and insert some fills. Level 2, we're going to use the chords to improvise. So we're just going to arpeggiate the 7th chords up and down through the entire progression. And we're going to use melodic continuity. This is a really good way to practice improvisation, where you just keep playing swung 8th notes with no rests and no pauses, just all the way through. So just a consistent rhythm of swung 8th notes. Now doing this, we can improvise something as follows. Right, so that was really simple. I was just outlining the chord progression by arpeggiating each of the chords. So over the C minor 7 chord, I would arpeggiate the C minor 7 chord. Going to the F7. Right, and so on. So in this case, I was just going up and down that 7th chord, but you could do something a bit more interesting, but still just using the notes of the chords, the chord tones, but not necessarily just going up and down. You can sort of skip notes and repeat and make little patterns and things like that, just to get a bit more of an interesting improvisation. Right, so same idea, still using melodic continuity, so those constant quavers, those constant eighth notes. Still using only the notes from each chord, but instead of just playing a simple arpeggio up and down, sort of varying the patterns a bit. Now in level 3, we're going to use the relevant diatonic scale, which in this case is the B-flat major scale. And we're just going to run up and down the B-flat major scale, not doing anything fancy, but just changing direction every now and then. We're going to use a really simple even swing rhythm, and we're going to continue using this melodic continuity technique. So doing this, we could get something as follows. Right, so really simple, really easy, quite boring, but that's kind of the idea. We're just getting used to the sound of the B-flat major scale over these chords. And if you're finding that too easy, then you can use the same melodic continuity idea, but use triplets instead of swung eighth notes. Right, so far this has been really simple, but it really doesn't sound like improvisation yet. It kind of sounds like we're just practicing scales. So in order to avoid that, we're going to do two things. Instead of just running up and down the B-flat major scale, we're going to start introducing skips and leaps. Right, so bigger jumps. Instead of just going step by step, we're going to start skipping and leaping. We're going to syncopate our rhythm by accenting odd combinations of notes. So maybe accenting some offbeats, and then accenting the one, and then the two and then the four and that way we're going to create some rhythmic interest. But we're still going to be using only the B-flat major scale. And as we're doing this, we're going to try and target or aim for one of the chord tones of each chord on beat 1 of every bar. So on the C minor 7, we're going to start on the C, E flat, G or B flat. Over the F7 on beat 1 of that bar, we're going to try and hit on beat 1 one of the notes of the chord, so F, A, C or E flat. So doing all of these things, we could create an improvisation as follows. Right, so still using melodic continuity, still using the B-flat major scale primarily, introducing some skips and leaps, so in a sense we're combining the arpeggios we played in level 2 with the scale runs we played in level 3, targeting a chord tone on beat 1 of every bar, and creating a bit of a syncopated rhythm by accenting interesting and irregular beats. Now level 5. So we're going to continue using the B-flat major scale, but instead of using melodic continuity, we're now just going to create really short phrases of between 3 and 5 notes, thereabouts, and then pause, and then create another little phrase, and then pause, and then create another little phrase, and so on. We're going to try and introduce some repetition and some call and response if we like, We're going to continue creating that interesting syncopated rhythm by accenting various notes on and off the beat. And we're going to try and end each phrase on a guide tone, so on the third or the seventh of the chord. And in that way we have a really strong and consonant finish to the end of our phrase, and it's going to sound good. So for example, over the C minor 7, we're going to play a little phrase and finish it either on the third or the seventh, the E flat or the B flat. In this case, I finished it on the B flat. Then when we move to F7, we have to play another little phrase and finish it on a guide tone. So in this case, I've finished it on the A, which is the third of the chord, and so on. So we're targeting the guide tone of each chord at the end of our little phrases. So doing this, we can create a little improvisation that sounds like this. Right, and that sounded quite nice. So again, we're just using B flat major scales, playing little phrases, finishing each phrase on a guide tone of the chord, and using a little bit of repetition. So I did something like, and then repeated it. So that little bit of repetition introduces a bit more sort of structure to your improvisation. Right, so already we're creating something that sounds a little bit more like a jazz improvisation rather than just us running scales or playing exercises. And that's because we've introduced these little phrases which are like melodic sentences. Instead of just running up and down, like using melodic continuity, which is a great way to practice, but it doesn't really sound like we're improvising, unless you're John Coltrane. So next, level 6, we're going to keep using the B flat major scale. Now we're going to increase our phrase length to medium phrases, so between 6 and 12 notes. We're going to continue targeting guide tones at the end of all of our phrases, but we're going to introduce some more interesting improvisation techniques. We're going to introduce chromatic passing notes, which are literally just that. They're chromatic passing notes on your way to another note in the scale. We're going to introduce chromatic runs. We're going to use side slipping, which is where you play a little phrase, then play it a semitone higher or lower, and then play the original phrase again. So then you're kind of playing a phrase, slipping to the side, and then slipping back. And we're also going to introduce some cycled patterns, which are essentially just a little phrase that you repeat at fixed intervals. Something like that. And in this way, we're going to start introducing outside notes to our improvisation. And these outside notes are going to create tension, which we're then going to resolve by slipping back into the diatonic scale, into the B flat major. So using this idea, we can improvise as follows. Right, so recapping what I just did, so still largely sticking to the B flat major scale and playing medium length phrases, still targeting guide tones at the end of every phrase, but inserting these slightly more interesting and really quite simple improvisation techniques. So I did some side slipping, I did a chromatic run, some chromatic passing notes and a cycled pattern at the end there, finishing on a guide tone. Great, now level 7. Now here we're going to ditch the B flat major scale and instead we're going to think about modes. But we're going to restrict ourselves to the modes of the major scale, so Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, so on. So for example, over the C minor 7 we could play C Aeolian, over the F7 we play F Mixolydian, over the B flat major 7 we could play B flat Lydian, and so on. So we're no longer sticking to the B flat major scale, we're now allocating individual modes based from the major scale to each of our chords. We're also going to play slightly longer phrases, so 12 notes and above. And instead of targeting guide tones, we're now going to target and finish each phrase on an available tension. So on a 9th, 11th, or 13th. And in this way, our phrases are going to sound a bit jazzier. They're not going to sound completely resolved because we're finishing on a chord tone or a guide tone. They're going to sound a little bit sort of tiny bit dissonant, but still quite nice and pleasant because it's an available tension. So doing this, we could play the following. Right, so there, for example, I played A Aeolian, F Mixolydian, B flat Lydian, E flat Ionian, A Locrian, D Mixolydian, finishing on G Dorian, I think, or something of the like. And I was ending phrases, so targeting available tensions. So over the F7, I finished the phrase on the D, which is the 13th. And at the very end there, I finished the little phrase on an A, which is the 9th. So that makes it sound a little bit jazzier. So going, right, creates that little tiny bit of dissonance rather than doing something like, which sounds really consonant because we're just playing a chord tone. Next, in level 8, we're going to use the blues scale. And in this case, the G blues scale, to improvise over this whole progression. Again, we're going to try and create longer phrases, and we're going to try and finish each phrase, so target the tonic note or a blue note. And again, the reason we're doing this is because blues is a big part of jazz, and so you really need to sort of be acquainted with the language of the blues in order to have a nice jazzy improvisation as well. The blues should inform your jazz improvisation. So just using the G blues scale, we could play something like this. Next, level 9, we're going to start introducing some more exotic scales into our improvisation. So things like melodic minor modes, whole tone scales, diminished scales, things of that nature. We're going to try use some more irregular phrases, so starting and finishing at unexpected times, being irregular lengths, so not like 2 bars or 4 bar phrases, maybe a 2 1/4 bar phrase. We're going to use some irregular rhythms to create maybe some more rhythmic interest in our improvisation. And we're going to try end our phrases on either a guide tone or an available tension, so alternating between the two. And so this is going to create a bit more of a chromatic, really quite jazzy sound. Right, so there I was using some more exotic scales. For example, over the F7 I used F whole tone. Over the D7 I used D half whole diminished. I used, I think, a Lydian augmented scale over the B flat major 7 and E flat major 7, and then A half diminished mode or scale over the A half diminished. And I was trying to use some more irregular rhythms, having it sort of be a bit more like angular and punctuated and a bit unusual. Now that doesn't sound particularly nice, and nor is it supposed to. We're using this as a kind of learning exercise to kind of push us more and more out of our comfort zone by sort of moving up these levels. Which brings us to level 10, our final level. Now in this level, we're going to be using the chromatic scale. We're going to use techniques such as substitution, and we're going to occasionally just fail to resolve tension. We're going to play a wrong note and commit to it and just hold it. We're going to use a combination of short, medium, long, regular, and irregular phrases. We're going to try and create some more like polyrhythms, and we're going to finish phrases on avoid notes or on wrong notes that are going to sound terrible. Again, remember, as a learning exercise. So doing this, we could play the following. Right, so that sounded terrible. It was very chromatic. I was hitting and targeting a lot of avoid notes, like I finished the last phrase on an A flat, which is a flat 9 over the G minor 7 chord, which sounded horrible. We created some interesting rhythms and polyrhythms, and it sounded very atonal and unpleasant. But again, that's kind of the point. We started with a really simple basic improvisation, and we've slowly added more and more and more complexity until we've got something really quite chromatic and dissonant and complex, both rhythmically complex and harmonically complex and melodically complex. So like I said, this has really been a learning exercise. I'm not trying to tell you that level 10, the really chromatic, jagged, angular, horrible sounding improvisation is better or more jazzy than level 2 or level 4 or level 6 or whatever. This is really just for practice. You should be relatively comfortable playing at all these different levels of complexity and on the spectrum between really clean, diatonic and pleasant to really atonal and out there and horrible sounding. Because ultimately the idea is not to sit at one particular level through your entire improvisation, but to kind of pick and choose and mix together all these different techniques and levels of dissonance and complexity into a holistic, nice sounding solo. So your solo can start diatonic and simple, but then you can chuck a little bit of atonality in there, and then chuck a little bit of blues in there, and then chuck a whole tone scale and some side slipping in there. The idea is, and the way I like to think about improvisation, is that we start with a bass scale, which is our B flat major in this case. And from this bass scale, we pivot back and forth between different more exotic scales, different improvisation techniques, different tension levels, and just sort of pivoting back and forth. So going bass scale, side slipping, bass scale, atonal tone cluster, bass scale, whole tone scale, bass scale, chromatic passing note. And in that way, you can actually create quite an interesting and complex sounding solo that's intuitively quite simple and actually quite pleasant. Having an improvisation that only uses the B flat major, the diatonic scale, like levels 1 through 3 or 4, whatever it was, sounds quite boring. And having an improvisation at level 10 the whole time, really chromatic and atonal, sounds crap, sounds horrible, sounds really unpleasant. But mixing and sort of pivoting between the two extremes and sort of the middle of the spectrum, you can create a really nice sounding improvisation. Something as follows. Right, so I've got some atonal elements in there that are building tension. I've got some improvisation techniques like side slipping and chromatic runs in there. But every so often I'm still pivoting back to that B flat major scale and resolving to a guide tone or an available tension. So I'm creating tension and then resolving it. And so practicing your improvisation and building it up through all these 10 different levels will give you the tools to be able to effectively pick any of those techniques or ideas or concepts at random and insert them into your basic improvisation. So then when improvising, I always look for a bass scale that will serve as my anchor, one that fits over all or most of the chords. And if I ever make a mistake or get lost, I just retreat back to the bass scale. So again, I just pivot back and forth between my bass scale and the various levels of complexity that we can add on top. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've just been using really simplistic harmony, just basic seventh chords. In reality, when performing, you'll want to use some more interesting and sophisticated, voicing substitutions and techniques. But that's a whole other story. Cool, so I hope that was somewhat helpful. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you next time.